Hello and welcome. Now, every year, on the 13th day of the Iranian month of Aban, which usually falls on the 4th of November, the Iranian nation, particularly students, hold rallies across the country to mark the anniversary of the U.S. Embassy takeover by a number of students after the victory of the Islamic Revolution. But this year's rallies come amid violent foreign-backed riots in the country, which have claimed the lives of dozens of people and security forces. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will take a closer look at the mass rallies that took place across the country and discuss the significance of the massive turnout, considering the recent developments. To discuss that further, we have with us Alicia Manier, journalist and political analyst from Brussels, and also Marcus Papadopoulos, historian and political analyst and author from London. Let's begin with Mr. Manier. Now, this year's Students' Day demonstrations fell on Friday, which is a weekend, of course, in Iran. We still witnessed a high number of people, including students as young as 11 or 12 years old, taking part. What does this signify?
Well, we have seen the day in 2020 when President Donald Trump assassinated General Qasem Soleimani and his companions in Baghdad, how millions of Iranians went to the street in support of the government and the state they have selected and they have voted for. And how today is exactly the same. We see again in the anniversary of the takeover of the US Embassy in 1979, the same number, if not more or less, of the population standing against the US imperialism and their attempt to change regimes everywhere around the world whenever there is a state or a regime that is standing against the US hegemony and dominance in the world. So today is very significant because Iran is again saying no to the US interference, notwithstanding the fact that President Joe Biden said he wants to free Iran. And Iran was freed in 1979 from the US dominance under the Shah. And it is again another indication from the Americans that what they want is to change the regime in Iran, and the response came from the street by the Iranian people to stand against the US plans and say, we're happy in our country without your interference, notwithstanding the fact that there are economic difficulties and there are manifestations in the street, but there are also riots pushed by these countries that they want to submit Iran under their dominance.
And now, Mr. Manier, it is actually very interesting that you should point to that out. Let's bring in Mr. Papadopoulos. In a clear show of interference, just as Mr. Manier just mentioned, a clear show of interference in Iran's domestic affairs. We heard Joe Biden say that he will, quote, free Iran. Of course, President Ibrahim Raisi was very quick to react, and he did not miss his words. And he said that Iran was freed 43 years ago. But it even sounds outrageous for any president to say such a thing. How does Joe Biden allow himself to make such a statement?
One must first of all say that there is almost complete ignorance in both America and Britain as to the origins of the Iranian Revolution. So I will very briefly enlighten the ignorant masses in the West. In 1979, the Iranian people from all walks of life came together to throw off the yoke of American and British tyranny and liberate Iran. And how did it come about that Iran was, in the first place, a vassal state of both America's and Britain's? Well, in 1953, the foreign intelligence services of America and Britain CIA and SIS respectively, engineered a coup in Tehran against the then Prime Minister and replaced him with a puppet Prime Minister. And from 1953 until the Iranian Revolution of 1979, successive prime ministers and governments, together with the Shah, served the interests of the American and British ruling elites and neglected the Iranian people. Indeed, everything in Iranian society was exploited by the Americans and the British. For example, Iran's natural resources were under the control of Washington and London, and also Western decadence appeared in towns and cities across Iran. So that is, in brief, the reason for the Iranian Revolution. Now, turning to Joe Biden's recent proclamation that America will liberate Iran, well, that is another demonstration of how America has contempt for international law and the United Nations Charter. After all, Biden said that he will, quote, liberate an independent sovereign country. That is an absolute affront to the very notion of a country's independence and sovereignty. But we know in practice what Biden and other American policymakers they will liberate a country. Their definition of liberation means they will subdue that country, they will put in power their puppets, and they will use and abuse that country. And the indigenous people of that country will have no say in the day-to-day running of their country. They will be mere slaves to America. So again, America has only contempt for international law and the United Nations Charter. And even though America seeks to liberate Iran, that will never, ever happen. The Iranian people are united. The Iranian Revolution is strong. And in my estimation, Iran is stronger now than it has been for many, many, many decades.
Mr. Manier, Mr. Papadopoulos pointed to the history behind the takeover of the U.S. Embassy. And that is actually a very important issue when it comes to discussing the relations between the U.S. and Iran. It is just unacceptable to discuss the takeover of the U.S. Embassy without pointing to toppling Mohammad Mossadegh's government, the democratically elected government by the CIA and, of course, also the UK intelligence. In your opinion, do you believe that history has been distorted by not pointing to the background story of the U.S. Embassy takeover? And how should this story be told?
Well, we have to admit that the mainstream media is stronger than the media in Iran or any other media that stand against the U.S. dominance and hegemony. Therefore, in the mainstream media, very often, there's not really a lot of emphasis on the coup d'etat against Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, and neither the role of the CIA and the British intelligence and how they made a mistake in the coup d'etat when they did not really coordinate with each other, but because they were having kind of fun and they can do it, so they just changed the regime. And that was a government that was elected by the people. So we understand that the Americans have no respect to democracy. Like Professor Jeffrey Sachs said, the Americans claim to be the most democratic domestically, but the most warmongers and ruthless and anti-democratic abroad. This is not democracy. So the Americans tend to cover their actions their attack and occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years, the result that this came up with the return of the Taliban after 20 years of war, the consequences of war in Iraq, how they've used depleted uranium against the Iraqis, the war in Syria, the occupation of Syria and the theft of the oil. So all these are really not mentioned. So we can't pretend from the mainstream media to recall upon all the bad work that the Americans have done against democracy. So now the world is concentrated, because they are very powerful in media, they concentrated on specific slogan, and they're very good at it. They're using social media. They have learned from many attempts in the past to create a coup d'etat in Iran in the last 43 years. And I remember in the last 13 years, they've started again. So they are really learning from all these mistakes. And every time we see something new, they are trying, but with the same objective, to change the regime. And the mainstream media understand that, but they certainly not going to say, well, this is what we are doing, and we are manipulating the narrative and guiding the public opinion toward democracy and human rights, and we're not doing it because there is a clear coup d'etat against Iran and a regime change. And this is why the White House today tried to change a little bit the meaning of the word of President Biden, because it clearly indicates that he wants to free Iran. It means he wants a regime change in Iran. And that is the main objective of all US presidents since President Jimmy Carter until today.
Mr. Papadopoulos, Iran's leader Ayatollah Khamenei has described Iran as an encouraging force for other nations to stand up against the bullying world powers, and has referred to this as the main reason behind the hostility that we see, and Mr. Manier also just mentioned right now, towards the Islamic Republic, and the fact that the U.S. is trying so hard for regime change. It has been, as Mr. Elijah rightfully mentioned, since Jimmy Carter. How effective do you believe Iran has been on the international scale with its approach?
Well, like Cuba, Iran for many decades now has withstood a barrage of economic sanctions placed on it by America and its allies. Furthermore, Iran has withstood the very hostile actions of America's friends and allies in West Asia. And also, Iran has withstood numerous attempts by America and its regional allies in the Middle East to bring about civil unrest in towns and cities across the country. And that is no mean feat. But I believe what it demonstrates is, first of all, the patriotism, the fierce patriotism of the Iranian people. Secondly, it demonstrates the iron faith that the Iranian people have in God. And thirdly, it shows how the Iranian people will never surrender their cultural and spiritual values to anyone or any country in this world. And that is to be applauded. Yes, does Iran have economic problems, for example? Yes, it does. Are there other problems in Iran? Of course there are. No country is perfect in the world. No system is perfect. But look at what Iran has achieved almost on its own in health, in welfare, in education, in military affairs, in engineering, in science, in sports, and so on and so on. Those achievements are all the more remarkable when one takes into consideration the very severe American sanctions placed on Iran. So I do believe that Iran and the Iranian people are a source of inspiration for other races across the world who are struggling to throw off the yoke of Western tyranny, of Western imperialism. And I believe that as a result of that, many people have become very interested in Iran, very interested in the Iranian Revolution. And as a result of that, the American narrative, although still very, very powerful to break, has weakened in recent years. But we must remember that Western mainstream media and Western social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter are a multi-billion-dollar industry. Iran, Russia, Cuba, Syria, and other independent sovereign countries are not going to defeat the multi-billion-dollar industry that is Western mainstream media and Western social media platforms. Nonetheless, all that matters is that countries such as Iran retain their independence and sovereignty, and they maintain their cultural and spiritual values.
Now, your analysis, Mr. Papadopoulos, totally falls in line with what President Raisi on several occasions has pointed out, that Iran's achievements in different areas while resisting the U.S. maximum pressure policy is the main reason behind the hostilities of the U.S. Mr. Manier, do you agree with this? How do you analyze the situation?
I fully agree with what has been said by my colleague. I can add to that that Iran changed the balance in the Middle East and in the region and imposed deterrence on Israel, on the United States, created the axis of the resistance, spoiled the US plans in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Palestine, including the Israelis' plans, and all of that by turning Iran into a powerful country, able to defend itself. It has created many enemies among the West and the Israelis. And because of that, Iran has become the perfect target. So we've seen that in Lebanon, we've seen that in Iraq, and now we're seeing it in Iran, where there is a kind of a genuine population in the street, and many other rioters and criminals who are mixed, and people are dragged without knowing into different slogans. This is when we've seen this happening before, and where they overthrow the Iraqi prime minister because he was making deals with China and because he asked the Americans to leave the country. We've seen that in Lebanon, but they have failed. And now we're seeing it in Iran, where they attack the social life. They attack the Islamic values of the Islamic revolution, because they go toward the hijab, and in Islam, the government cannot ask women to remove their hijab, while the hijab became suddenly the slogan of freedom and democracy. So this is why when I said they're very good at targeting specific issues, very sensitive issues, because they have tried this before, they have a lot of experience. So because Iran has excel in defending itself, in creating the resistance economy, notwithstanding the thousands of sanctions imposed on the Islamic Republic, when Trump was saying, I'm sitting by the phone and waiting for Iran to call me because I want them to starve. And when Mike Pompeo said, if they want to eat, they have to call me and they have to come to the nuclear deal according to our term, it is obvious that Iran is creating a lot of pain to these leaders who want to submit Iran. It is obvious, and we have to expect even more in the future, that the West, the Mossad, the CIA, all the intelligence services that work under the control of the Americans do even more and become more aggressive than they are today, kill more policemen, burn more ambulances, destroy more governmental institutions, and kill innocent people in the street, target clerics, innocent people who are walking by or just not involved in these riots. And all of that is just to take some pictures, and they have already their electronic army to just spread these images and give the impression that all of Iran is rising, when what's happening today in Iran and all the people who demonstrate against the American hegemony and against the American bad doing in the world, they are not reported by mainstream media. So we have to expect that. We have to, the more Iran becomes strong, the more violent is going to be attack on Iran. This is what we need to be prepared to see in the future, and this is what Iran needs to be prepared to face.
Mr. Papadopoulos, we are running out of time, but Mr. Manier pointed to the fact that hijab has turned into a tool for the U.S. And today we saw lots of young ladies taking part in the rallies today. And of course, they were quite conspicuous compared to the previous years, taking into account that these foreign-backed riots have been using hijab as a tool. What was the message? We're running out of time. If you could please wrap this up in about a minute.
All I want to say about the hijab is that this is a matter for the Iranian people to discuss and to decide on. I am an outsider. The Americans are outsiders. The British are outsiders. Anything to do with Iran is to be decided by the Iranian people. And when American and British politicians and mainstream journalists talk about supporting women's rights in Iran, this is an abhorrent form of inversion. How many women across the world have died because of America's wars? And on top of that, in America and in Britain, women's rights are being eroded. Furthermore, the very identity of women is being eroded. In America and in Britain, mothers are being told by politicians, journalists, doctors and nurses that they are no longer mothers, that they are people. And yet Washington and London have the audacity to say they support women's rights. They care nothing for women's rights. They care nothing for the Iranian women. They care nothing for the Iranian people as a whole. All they care about is maintaining and strengthening Western global hegemony and exporting Western degeneracy and Western decadence to all four corners of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst and author from London, and Alicia Manier, journalist and political analyst from Brussels. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of The Spotlight. It's all the time that we have for now. And thanks to all of our viewers for following this edition.